Witam Państwa na...
Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome you to the third session of today's conference. Well, I would say the following. During the previous panel that was devoted to the Balkan and Visegrad area, a lot was said that it's a very complex topic, a very complex area, and I think it is time to make it even more complicated. In other words, to address Syria. I welcome Mr. Ivan Krasnal, Patrycja Sasnal, and Konstanty Gebert. I thank you very much for taking part in this debate. You possibly recognize that there's nobody from Syria amongst us. And this is not an expression of arrogance or paternalism. We made an effort to have persons directly linked with the Syrian topic to take part in this debate. Well, unfortunately, we did not succeed, which means more or less that you need to keep in the back of your mind that we're speaking about the Syria in a group of Europeans or a group of actually Central Eastern Europeans. And I think this is material, this is important to bear in mind. I see our discussion in the following way. I think we all realize that the conflict in Syria, in fact, this Syrian knot is, if I could use a copy from the English, is really expresses most of the problems of contemporary Europe, or actually the world, with respect to geopolitics, military aspects, as well as human rights and refugee-related issues. So I would say that this is also a situation that has a serious bearing on the economy. So any attempt to capture this conflict is important in light of any debate on contemporary times. But in order to be able to address this, we have to first of all try to map it And I will try to break down this mosaic of the Syrian conflict, both as within Syria as a state, but also within what we know as Syria and adjoining countries such as Iraq. But also to understand this mosaic from an external perspective. In other words, from, let's say, a distant zoom on this situation, hence a zoom on the geopolitics of the region. So I think it's really material to ask how this conflict is unfolding right now, today, on Friday, the 11th of March. So what seems important, since we are meeting in this group, is to speak about something that I would call errors of the West. In other words, what have happened, where we made errors, where we had made mistakes. Why did we allow the situation to unfold the way it has? And finally, different scenarios of resolving the Syrian conflict, with a particular focus on scenarios that we, in our context, could implement. In other words, what we in Poland, in Bulgaria, could do in order to put this conflict to rest. Without a doubt, we cannot avoid, in this case, a question about the Islamic State, and also questions on the scenario for the future of the Islamic State, this proto-state, which is also the conductor, or one of the conductors, in leading the situation. So first of all, let's look at the map of the Syrian conflict. I would like to ask Patrycja Sasnal, amongst us, you are the most competent person in order to speak about this. How is this, what is this mosaic of the conflict? Who against whom? Why? Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, first of all. I'm a little bit surprised with this question, because what I will be saying in no way is sort of new. I will present to you a map of Syria. I'm sorry that we don't have such a map, because this would be much more visible. But first of all, try to imagine Syria as a sort of a reversed triangle with its spear focusing the east. The other back of the triangle is urbanized cities: Idlib, Aleppo, Hama, Homs, Damascus, and Bara. Sort of an urban strip. And this is the heart of Syria. The heart of Syria, that most of the people reside in this belt. And then the spear, if I can call it, pointing to the east, is mainly desert, with just a few larger cities. There's Azur, Raqqa, over 200,000 population, today's capital of the so-called Islamic State, Hashak-Kamishin, in the north, Kurdish areas. But first of all, let me ask the term regime. We usually use the term regime when we speak about the Damascus government, but they are still nonetheless the government. They have their representative in the UN, they have their emissaries and diplomatic representations throughout the world. And we are under, let's say, the influence of a Eurocentric narration, where we state that this is the Rouge regime that nobody supports. But a big part of the world supports it. If we were to list some editorials from the Indian press, from Brazilian newspapers or Libyan newspapers, these texts would speak about the Damascus government and not the Damascus regime. And this government has the support of Russia, Iran. The Iranians are in fact fighting in Syria on behalf of the Bashar Assad regime, but they're also fighting with the so-called Afghan people. So Hezbollah is also in support of the regime. What territory Assad controls? This is sometimes called the small Syria, Damascus, Homs, Hamad, then towards Latakia and the Mediterranean coast. And today, after the armed involvement of Russia in this conflict, and they also captured the north of Aleppo, the areas north of Aleppo. Well, nearly this entire belt, the urban belt, have been captured, but not in full, not Dara in the south, but definitely they're under offensive. So this is the regime. The opposition now. The opposition is very diversified. The opposition to the regime are the Kurd population, but now they have this so-called tacit peace with the Damascus regime because they do not interview with one another, and one could think that this is a form of an alliance or a partnership that will lead to some future friendship, because the Kurdish population remember very well the times where Damascus was responsible for murders and also the Kurds are supported by Russia and the United States, and I think this will also be a lead to the complicated situation in the West. And the opposition is also the ISIS, the Islamic State, which controls only a handful of cities, Raqqa, Tara, Yazor, Palmyra, partly, and also the roads between those cities. The rest, well, there's nothing to control because that's the desert. In Syria and Iraq, there are about 7 million people, but in Syria, it's, let's say, well, over 1 million people who are living under this area controlled by the Islamic State. Who supports the Islamic State from the outside? It's difficult to say 100% because to a large extent, this organization is self-sufficient. And if I were to say that these are states in the Persian Gulf, one could then risk that this would be a very vague, very unprecise, because what is a state in many Gulf countries is confused with what is private. So it's difficult to really separate state and private money. And as I said, the Islamic State doesn't really need funding from outside. And there's also opposition, or we're really speaking about 5 years since March 2011, when the events of Dara in the south of Syria, the teenagers, for having written on the wall, "The regime must fall," were stopped by the police. They were arrested, and the fingernails were pulled off the fingers of the teenager, and this was really the beginning of the boiling pot and the hotbed. And the so-called moderate opposition, moderate to different degrees, and I didn't want to even speak about the relative degrees of moderation, but let's say 90% of people fighting today in the so-called Army of the Free Syria, or another coalition which is called Jaish al-Fatah, and that is the Army of Conquest, are wearing long beards, and they look like Islamists. But what does it tell us? Well, only that the opposition is deeply religious, or possibly only religious for tactical reasons, to sort of seize the moment. So who are the people? It's Hara Asham, an organization that is very strong in the north, supported by Turkey quite intensively. And these are also local revolutionary committees, or local fighting committees, and there are over 200, 600, as an Oklahoma University has calculated. And this is the opposition. And opposition today is more focused in the south, in Dara, and also in the north, near Aleppo and Gebert. And that's it. Who supports them? Saudi Arabia, officially, Qatar, the Gulf countries, the US, European countries, and Turkey. There are also another organization, a terrorist, jihadist organization, at least recognized as a jihadist by the UN, and Jabhat al-Nusra. branch of Al-Qaeda. But the Islamic State, you have to remember, is in a way also a branch of Al-Qaeda, an originally branch of Al-Qaeda, which then broke that affiliation. One more word about the Kurdish, the Kurds. We don't see it on this map, but there are two Kurdish areas, the historical Rojava in the north of Syria, northeast of Syria, bordering on Turkey, very large territory, and a small Kurdish territory to the northwest of Syria in the Hatay province, also bordering on Turkey. And Turkey, in the future, when we speak about engagement of neighboring countries in Syria, Turkey is really most concerned that those two territories will merge and that physically they'll be able to travel to each other, and this way they will consolidate Kurdish territory. And Turkey always repeats it, is not an ethnically Kurdish territory. So this would be really the red line. With its cross, Turkey will definitely enter Syria. And there's another actor of this conflict, which is never mentioned, that is the Syrian population, which is not armed, which is not running in the streets with guns. And 12 million of that population, approximately 12 million of that population, the total population of Syria is about 21 million, but 12 million have shifted internally and externally. 2.7 is about outside of Syria, but others were relocated within Syria. So if we take out from 21, 12, that's 8, and then 1.5 million who are living under the rule of the Islamic State, so 5 million remain. So about 4 million really reside in areas which are now not sort of taken away from the Damascus regime. So, so we assume that in a way they give support to Bashar Assad. So what are the affiliations? What are the political sympathies? It's very difficult to say. Well, without a doubt, many still don't really know what to think and who to support. And another work about Geneva talks, and I think that this is important in the context of the present-day situation. There is a thesis that the Geneva talks, because in November of last year, there was a group organized, which was called the International Support for Syria, which comprises a number of international organizations, the UN, the European Union, and 17 nation states, regional and not only. And talks in Geneva were started. A preliminary agreement between the US and Russia has been made as how this peace process is to unfold. And the opposition also united. They came to Geneva. The regime came to Geneva. They didn't see each other. They didn't sit at the same table, but negotiations were ongoing with the intermediation of Staffan de Mistura and the UN special envoy of the UN. So this was really a thesis, a theory that this all happened because on the last day of September last year, Russia strengthened its military presence in Syria. But this is not true. Well, possibly the intensity of the process was dependent on Russia's involvement. But throughout the summer last year, in the UN, efforts were made in order to initiate such a process. And this was already in the wings, so to say. This was already discussed. And Russia, possibly knowing that this would start, among others, for that very reason, has also joined with bigger impetus in the war in Syria. And right now we're in a situation where on Monday the talks are to be resumed in Geneva. It seems that there is some new agreement, let's say a stronger agreement between Russia and the US in order to maintain the fortnight-long ceasefire between the regime and the opposition, with in the exception of Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. So this ceasefire is still maintained. So thank you very much. I'd like to now address Mr. Krastev. Patrycja Sasnal, mentioned the countries that we more frequently we recognize as taking part in the Syrian mosaic outside of Syria. US, Russia, Turkey, the Gulf countries, Europe. If now we could try to read in or read between the lines, what are the interests of those stakeholders, those players, actors? What would they be? What are they after?
Let's start with a confession. I was a latecomer here. Somebody didn't come. And this is why I'm on this panel. I'm saying this because, unlike the other colleagues, I do not have a specific expertise on Syria. There are three things that I know something about, and this is what I'm going to talk. I know Syria very much from the perspective of how Russia foreign policy is trying to conceptualize it. And the other is basically the United States position. So basically, from this point of view, to ask me about Iran or Saudi Arabia and so on, I'm going to reproduce the cliche that you can read in any newspaper. I have never talked to anybody there. The interesting story, and to understand the Russian position on Syria, which is slightly more complicated than we're trying to talk about, is to remember two things. First is Afghanistan, and the fact that the Soviet Union was the result of a peaceful revolution, but also of the mobilization of the militant Islam on the side of the West against Soviet Union. This is deeply in the Russian policy circles, because don't forget, Russia is the European country with the biggest Muslim minority. And in a certain way, what was keeping the country together was very much the Soviet legacy. If you see, the Russian state has a huge problem to socialize young Muslims. It's basically either indirect rule, like in Chechnya, or kind of a Dagestan is more complex situation, but basically they don't have the model for this. Secondly, the Arab Revolution was a major challenge to understanding on the Russian side how the American power works. Because Russians didn't like that the Americans support counter revolutions in the post-Soviet space, but this fits very easy in the logic of the Cold War. You destabilize basically the sphere of influence of the other. The major story is why you are destabilizing Mubarak, one of your older ally and somebody who has been very instrumental, especially with the relations with Israel. And this was an interesting story. And now, if you are following the American media, you can see that there is a lot of flow of new information, how difficult this decision was taken. Basically, it was President Obama on one side, with some of the young advisors, and it was the Secretary of Defense and Mrs. Clinton on the other saying, let's not do it. I do believe that the interesting story to understand why Obama do it is also to remember the generational experience. Probably when President Obama was seeing all these thousands of people on the street against the old dictator, he remembered Iran in 1979, when the Americans decided to stay with their own guy, and for the next 40 years, basically, they live with the consequences. So from this point of view, but as a result of it, from the Russian point of view, it was a much more general conceptualization. They basically decided that America, which in their view is a declining hegemon, is going to keep its hegemony by destabilizing the world in a big way. So the United States is going to function as a revolutionary power. They're going basically to create different problems in the world, and as a result of which, not to allow some of the competing other players to come. You can agree or disagree, but it's very important to know what is the assumptions on the base of which the other side goes. As a result of it came also Libya, which strengthened very much this understanding that the United States, because from the point of view of the Russians believe Americans cannot be idiots to believe that Egypt or Libya are going to become democracies. Because they believe it's totally cynical discourse. They don't buy for a minute the idea that it could be a genuine discourse about democracy promotion. If this is not the case, why you're doing this? So you're creating something which is a managed chaos. But this managed chaos is going to be the condition under which the American power is going to function. As a result of it, basically, one of the major arguments for Russia's intervention in Syria was, let's put it, pedagogical. To try to teach the world and to the Americans that it is the American policy that is the major source of instability. There was many other reasons why they did it and how they did it, but it's quite important to understand this broader view, because only on the understanding of this, you basically can understand how limited or non-limited the operation is going to be. The second thing that happened in Syria, and this is extremely important, is that Obama himself started to be afraid of this type of a getting out of control revolutionary policies, and we came to a moment which became a major crisis in the credibility of the American foreign policy. This was the famous Red Line speech. Basically, the President Obama said, if he's going to use chemical weapons, this is a red line, we're going to intervene. He used, Americans didn't intervene. Even more, when he said Assad must go, this was a very strong incentive for Syrians really to go on the street, because they said he's over. And he was not over. And this is a huge problem, because this, for example, explains a lot of tensions between Turkey and the United States at the moment. The level of the anti-Obama sentiment in the Turkish government is incredibly high. Seen from outside, people like to talk about West versus Russia. I was in Ankara last week. The level of anti-Americanism there is incredible. Anti-Obama, let's put it not anti-Americanism. They do believe that all the American agencies were ready to intervene, and the Obama stopped them. This created a dynamics, and this is going to be my last point, because I do believe that the Russian-Turkish conflict has a logic of its own, and this logic is going to influence very much what's going on. Listen, this was a conflict that should not have happened. For many reasons, in Putin's understanding of the regional politics, Turkey was a strange ally, but it was an ally. Don't forget, Turkey was the only member of NATO which did not impose sanctions after Crimea. And this is nevertheless that in Turkey there are around 5 million Tatars living. So from this point of view, there is also domestic constituency which were putting pressure on Crimean issue. And nevertheless, Turkey decided that they prefer to be slightly independent-minded regional power, and as a result of it, they don't have an interest to break relations with Russia. Russia, on the other side, decided that Turkey, because Russia's definition of sovereignty basically is to have the will and capacity to resist the United States. When they said that somebody is a sovereign country, when they said that the European Union is not a sovereign player, it means the absence of willingness and capacity to resist the United States. So they believe that Turkey has this willingness and capacity, and also after the Tahrir Square protests, basically there was a lot of similarity of sentiments. Putin and Erdogan can talk hours about the betrayal of the West and how they're meddling and so on and so on. But, and here comes the interesting story, when it comes to Syria, the clash was extremely important, because for Turks, they believe that Russia should not do what they're doing because Turkey is defending its territorial integrity, because for them the Kurdish issue basically means that Turkey can collapse in its present borders. You can agree or disagree with their basically judgment of the risk, but this is the consensus in Ankara, that basically if the Kurdish basically mobilization is going to spread, this is going to change. And here, just because our colleague was making, in my view, a very precise analysis, in the Kurdish understanding, there was a major difference between the Kurdish region in Iraq and in Syria. Iraq is very much more conservative type of a Kurdish community with which they have been negotiating and they're doing business. But the Syrian part, especially Rojava, this was the traditional area of the PKK support. So for them, basically, it was PKK. And as a result, you came to a conflict. This conflict developed unsuspectedly because Turks are claiming, and I'm even ready to trust them, that they were not sure what plane they're hitting. Was it a Russian plane or Syrian plane? But they wanted to make clear that they're tough, that they're not going to allow, and of course they were very much unsettled because of the attacks on the Turkmenis. But what happened was, it was not the plane. It was the decision of Erdogan to call NATO before calling Russia that totally broke the relationship. And here we have a new development, and this is the last one that I want to make. Russia policy towards Turkey changed so radically that if you want basically to define this policy, it is a regime change. In a certain way, Russia is doing to Turkey everything which they accuse America of doing to them as a regime change, which means, first, the economic sanctions in their severity, in the way they basically can hurt By the way, tougher than our sanctions on Russia after Crimea. Secondly, they started a direct negotiations with the Kurds, both in Turkey and in Syria, something that, as you know, Russians are not going to tolerate if, for example, the West now starts this talk on their territory. So from this point of view, we're going to have a relationship which is very much based on some of the major regional powers trying to totally destabilize each other. By the way, the Turks responded. They went to Azerbaijan, they went to Ukraine. Now, if you're listening to the Turks, they're the biggest defender of the Crimean issue and so on, slightly late, I do believe. And of course, this started to spill over in many countries. Speaking like a Bulgarian, to be honest, Bulgaria now looks like a bad spy movie. Basically, with the Russians and Turks clashing, and we kind of watching, even not buying the ticket. But I do believe this type of a situation is extremely important, because all is based on the fact that we do not know what is going to be the American policy, because we don't know simply not who is going to be the next president, but what the next president is going to do, keeping in mind that the American public is not interested to support much activism there. European Union, listen, this is the other story. We pretend to be an actor. I don't believe we're an actor, but I'm not saying, because to be an actor there means what? A lot of allies on the ground, a lot of knowledge, but also some military power projections, which I don't believe that we have. But this conflict, and because of the refugees, also changing the very way European Union is looking at its neighborhood. If 2 years ago the question was how we're going to transform our neighbors, now the idea is how our neighbors are transforming us. If 2 years ago the idea was we need on our borders liberal regimes, basically, which are going to spread our powers, now we're happy to live with illiberal regimes, because for the illiberal regimes it's easier to stop refugees. We don't like what Erdogan is doing, but this is because of the nature of the Erdogan regime. You can have this type of negotiations we have. So from this point of view, I do believe that I cannot comment on the basically Shia, Sunni, and this type. Simply, I don't have enough knowledge. But I do believe that we cannot understand Russia's position in Syria simply as let's divert the attention of Ukraine. It's much bigger. It's much more based on the way how they see the world as a whole. And from this point of view, of course, Ukraine is a much more priority from a certain perspective, but it is very much a real-time negotiations about the nature of the world order. Sorry.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much. Ivan Krastev mentioned the European Union as an actor or non-actor. I would now like to address Konstanty Gebert. Let's for a moment stop with the European Union and Europe, and let's reflect. What is the understanding in Europe about what's happening in Syria in 2011? What were the possible scenarios of resolution for the conflict in the free army of Syria and the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and how this situation and how we in this part of Europe perceive the situation today. And I must say that this is also a question about errors. In general terms, the errors of the West. Even Krastev also spoke about the attitude of Americans, or even more personally, about the attitude or the stance taken by Barack Obama. From what Patrycja Sasnal said, we can venture the question whether the so-called West did not invest its power into the weakest link of the opposition. That's number one. The second issue is whether the so-called West anticipated the strong veto on Russia's part, Russia's behavior, or they thought that Russia would be capable of taking steps toward intervention. So the West, did the West imagine that there could be a situation where, in practical terms, imagining absence of al-Assad and the future Syria would not be possible? In your opinion, what was in the mind of Europe then, what happened over the years, what mistakes had been made, where we had erred in judgment. And anecdotal situation like France closed down its embassy for a few weeks after the turmoil in Syria, and it turned out it was really quite premature. Well, I do believe that the fundamental error that was and will continue to be made in terms of the Syria situation is imagining that this is a problem to be resolved. This is not a problem to be resolved. It's an autonomous process where those who want to resolve a problem are becoming one of the numerous players, even though they had imagined that they had the capacity and the understanding on how to solve the problem. Syria is like a three-dimensional chess game where the rules change as we play. And without this historical dimension, it is simply impossible to understand what's happening on the ground there. And we are then tempted to reduce this conflict to a simple formula, that it's a fight of cruel regime with democratic opposition that wants to topple this regime and create a country of rule of law, or that it's a conflict between Russia and the US, or it's the beginning of a religious war between the Shiite and Sunnite. But this is all true, but alongside a dozen other elements that are interwoven, and you never can predict which will turn out to be the most significant, the most important. So before I answer your question, let me complicate this picture a little bit, because what Patrycja and what Ivan said could be interpreted that this is a key to understanding the situation, but this is just one of many keys. And in the historical perspective, the deep historical perspective of the current conflict is rooted in the situation that in its post-war history, Syria was the ground of international conflict, starting with this rivalry between the two bus parties, the Syrian and Iraqi wings, and which made that the Syrian regime was seeking support in Iran, knowing that the enemy of my enemy is my ally. True imperial ambitions of Turkey, who thinks about Syria the way Russia thinks today about Ukraine. Well, they're independent, but it was always ours. The grave of our Sultan is located there. They don't recognize our borders because Syria always thought that in Alexandria it's theirs. Illegally separated, and PKK also has its roots in Syria. It was supported by the Syrian regime. In the 1990s, Turkey was on the eve of prepared to wage a regular war with Syria to stop support for PKK, which they consider to be a true threat to the state. And as any other borders in the Middle East, the Syria-Iraqi border is really sort of contractual. The Iraqi state is the Gazeta land, this island, if you will, which was connected historically and economically and ethnographically, and these were divided, but nobody really observed that divide. And it was mainly a flow from Iraq, and not only the fundamental Sunnite from Iraq, but also a big portion of the state apparatus of Hussein that converted to Islam as another ideology that created a bound for them to rebuild the ties between those two areas of Dalir separated by border, which Assad welcomed because the state was a diversion in the camp of their opponents. And so there are many conspiracy theories, how the Islamic State was created. You will hear that Assad simply released all the Islamists out of the state to build the Islamic State as a diversion against the democratic opposition. And it's true, Assad actually released a lot of Islamists from the jails and had done nothing about the Islamic State for a long time. In Tehran, you'll hear that well, Israel was created together with the US in order to ruin its reputation. So without all these processes, which are autonomous, as you will, it's impossible to understand the Syrian conflict, and hence it's simply impossible how to think about, even to engender on coming up with solutions. The European Union was a player that was really a marginal player, though very important in one point in time, namely when Obama has already taken the decision to speak about those red lines and was prepared to give the attack order. Cameron, remembering what happened when Blair joined the Americans against Iraq, against the opinion of the political classes, and he asked for approval for the Syrian intervention, and the parliament said no. So since Obama lost its best ally, and he decided to nonetheless not follow on his threats, which infuriated the French, who were ready to strike the blow. The French, which was a colonial power in Syria and for many years had excellent relations with the Assad regime, and then were very much disillusioned with it, the same as Turkey, because there was this visa-free regime. Erdogan spoke about Assad as my brother. He spent his holidays in Assad's home, and there are more such regimes madly disillusioned with Assad. And if I was Putin, I would study the disillusionment. So France was actually ready to deal a blow, but Americans withdrew and left the French alone. And in the Atlantic issue, there's a great article by Jeffrey Kohlberg, who describes that situation of the so-called Hamlet attitude of Obama and why Obama failed not to follow through on his threat, which some analysts of his politics believe that this is the time when Americans lost the Middle East because they lost credibility. Others, however, believe that Obama simply drew conclusions from the Libya fiasco and decided that since this will end in a fiasco, there's no point in throwing money at this, since nothing can change.
Jest bardzo...
There is a very seductive way of thinking about the West's mistakes, whereby we use the Spanish matrix in order to understand the situation. Because the opposition against the Assad regime was initially really what we dream about and what we consider the good change, the right change. This was a heroic mass social civic movement where people for months would go into the streets, out in the streets, and be struck by bullets of the regime, but they would fight against their right not to be murdered and to live in a civilized country. And after months of such peaceful demonstrations, they finally seized weapons, and that never influenced the regime, but it only got them the sympathy of the West. So you could perhaps draw a similarity between that and the Kosovo demonstrations, and after a while, when they created a very brutal partisan army, it suddenly turned out that they could be party to the negotiations, and they could even be the winning party. There's an analogy also between this and the Spain of the 1930s, where democracies refused their support to the Spanish Democrats, whereas the communists and the fascists did support their party. And when communists really destroyed whatever was left from Spanish democracy, it turned out that there was no one left to support because both parties were bandits. And this is a description that very much resembles what our description of the Syrian situation changed, but a comparison is not the reason. We have no proofs that if had the Spanish Democrats been supported, they would have won. And we have no evidence that these wonderful, heroic people who fought in the streets of Damascus for their basic rights could have won even with our support. Today, we know that they have lost for sure. It's not yet clear who won, but they definitely lost. And it looks as though the United States have lost too. Their credibility has reached the bottom of the Dead Sea, and their former allies, the Saudis, said that they betrayed them with Iran and that they cannot be relied on. But from the point of view of the American interests, since the United States became self-reliant in terms of fuel, it seems very sensible not to waste billions of dollars and thousands of American lives in the Middle East war where there are no tangible results. What the winner right now is Russia so far. The arguments that Russia is defending its only Mediterranean base seems a bit far-fetched because it doesn't really use that base. But Russia is proving that, unlike Americans, it is a reliable ally, and that Assad's regime that everybody thought was going to collapse. And it is with great shame that I did say or write that these were the last days or perhaps weeks of the regime. This regime has survived and is now winning only because it struck a strong pact with the Russian regime. And if you want to be a Middle Eastern dictator, you should draw conclusions. It's really worth striking a deal with Russia, and it's not worth striking a deal with Washington. They will abandon you. They will have other significant agendas, whereas you can rely on Russia. The trouble is only we see the success of Russia in a very short-term perspective. Before soldiers come back or dead bodies come back to Russia, it's impossible to control the area from airspace, and when soldiers need to be deployed, this will be different. Russians are hoping that Kurds will fight for them. Kurds have found themselves in an unprecedented situation since the situation of the Palestinian Jews during the vote of the UN in 1947, when the resolution was supported by the US and Russia. And it is the first situation where two superpowers support a specific force in the Middle East. And the Americans are now trying to persuade the Kurds to strike eastward, so in fact to wage the land war for America with the Islamic State. But the Russians are trying to persuade the Kurds to strike westward and to combine both these cantons and to create a foundation of perhaps a future Kurdish statehood in Syria, and to teach a lesson to Erdogan. But it looks as though the Syrian Kurds are so far have been playing it really well. This is all very interesting, but we're checking to see who is going to bet more. It is not obvious that it's in the Kurdish interest to be the American army, and it is not obvious also that it is in the Kurdish interest to wage war on Turkey, especially that the Iraqi Kurds do not want that. They have an alliance with Turkey, and they are not really very much welcoming a new Kurdish structure that could perhaps disturb its current dominance in the political arena. And I'm not saying that we should be expecting a breakthrough tomorrow. I'm saying this because we are aware that no one's in control of the situation. It's not as if it's enough to put enough soldiers or enough money or enough political determination to shape this situation. This situation is being shaped by dozens of autonomous factors. And from the EU perspective, there's the only thing that matters are the refugees. And already now we are aware that we are prepared to pay any ransom to Erdogan as long as he turns off the refugee tap. But the ultimate source of refugees is Syria itself. They will only stop flowing into Europe in one specific case, if they convince them that they're worse off here than they are at home. People who flee their home to save their life will know really, will not really worry about any potential fences on the Macedonian border or the change of power in Zagreb. If we're capable of, in fact, heeding to Erdogan's blackmail, then we should support the only force that is able to close that border, that is Assad. And if Assad wins in that war, then there will be more refugees, because most refugees are fleeing Assad's bombs. And if they have a choice between slitting someone's throat or mass destruction from air force, then of course they prefer the Islamic State than Assad. If Assad wins this, there will be more refugees unless Assad is helped to protect the borders. So the final resolution for the European Union would be not only to give in to the Turkish blackmail, but also to support, reconstruct the most brutal regime in the Middle East. But if we are determined, and it looks as though Europeans are determined, that we are prepared to pay as much as it takes in order to not have the refugees here, then this is the bill. Thank you. Patrycja, Sasnal. I'm not sure about the planning arrangements here, but I was only able to say trivialities and draw the picture of a map, but I've not had the opportunity to say anything else. So I need to refer to what you have said, both of you. Can I? Konstanty, it's very wise what you said, that this problem cannot be solved. But what worries me in both of your interventions is that there are no Syrians, the people of Syria, the people who live there, who experience the conflict. And number two is that somewhere, in perhaps not so much in your intervention, but somewhere between the lines, I saw the expression of guilt that the United States have to bear. Not so much in your intervention, but I think in advance slightly more. And I'm really deeply worried about this, and I want to explain why. No matter where I go in the Middle East, and it's not just Tehran, it's Egypt, it's Israel, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Qatar, it's Turkey, it's Tunisia, Algeria, wherever I go, the biggest culprits that is blamed for everything, for ISIS, for Islamization, for secularization, everything is blamed on the United States. And I think that this results, and we perhaps support this opinion, and it could be for three reasons. We have a tendency to think from a historical perspective, but not reaching so far as the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, but we don't even remember what happened in 2011. There was a big euphoria at the time, and it was even appealing for Russia, because they abstained from their vote on the Libyan case. So it's not as if the United States suddenly have inspired the people to go out and demonstrate in the streets, although this is how it was covered in Russia. They were very fearful when Mubarak was abandoned by the US. But within the administration, there was an ongoing debate, but on Obama's not on Obama's side, on Pentagon side, there were people who did not want to abandon Mubarak, but Hillary Clinton was not there. The Libya war was described as the female war, the women's war, the Powell, Clinton, and all these women who were there in the Department of Defense, etc. Exactly. So this was the war of American women, right? There was the Department of State and the Pentagon, and just like in any other state, in Poland too, the political decision makers are divided into those who are ultimately capable of standing up to the establishment but only if they feel that they represent the right side of history at some point in the future. And the safeguarding establishment, the army, the intelligence, etc., will always support stability and not changing status quo as long as it's reasonably possible, and of course as long as they have a benefit in it. And the same happened back in 2011 in the United States. So it was a difficult decision. However, Mrs. Clinton thought that Mubarak needed to be abandoned ultimately, although she did have some doubts. But the historical point of view, we forget that the United States had something to think through as well. It was them and the UK. Erdogan was the first who said that Assad had to go, and then subsequently, in the late spring, the same was said about by Obama. And now we interpret his caution as a weakness, and suddenly it's surprising that there's an American president that is cautious instead of reaching out for the gun wherever there's a shooting. I don't know. I think that in Israel, they're hoping that Obama is a system error and then it will just change very quickly. But I think that really it's a first president in many since Bush Sr. who is actually cautious. He doesn't want to flirt with any alternatives. What would have happened if, right? We can't know what would have happened if. If America had intervened and had sent the recruits for there would be a lot more recruits for the jihad right now, many more. So perhaps if we flirt with this idea, it gives us the conclusion that what is needed is a cautious president, rather than one that pulls a shotgun and shoots flies. But the truth is that Russia has really felt the wind in its sails, and there is no element of caution for them that would cause them to try and stop from crossing the border. I'd probably rather see Obama showing these borders. So our anti-American sentiment puts us in the same camp with the most authoritarian regimes in the world. If we think that about the United States, this results from the fact that we fear Russia, but we're too weak ourselves, and this influences our understanding of the Syrian situation, and this is what it is. It is a problem that cannot be solved. I have a lot more to say about Russia, but I don't want to take too much time. Ivan Kostov.
Well, to be absolutely honest, I'm not the one that is blaming or not blaming America. When you're hegemonic power, of course, you blame what you're doing and not doing. This goes with the job. The basic problem in the American decision-making is that we don't know counterfactually if Obama was done the other thing. Was it going to be better or not? This is the other story. This to Egypt and Libya, it was very different from the point of view of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, in her own memoirs, basically said that she believes that Mubarak should be given 3 or 4 more months. It was very much about much more negotiated transition. And David Ignatius made a whole op-ed saying how smart she was. We don't know, because the problem with the revolutionary politics is, and I very much here agree with Kostek, that outside powers are much less important than it looks. Russia and the United States are very important in this conflict on the level of the op-ed. On the level of the ground, they're not much present because both of them are very much in the air. And my major story is the following. I do believe that the limits of power is what we learned there. Of course, there are certain experiences. Obama was very much hurt by the Iraqi experience, where basically the revolutionary policy was not simply invading, but then destroying the Iraqi army. Something which, if there is a consensus on the American side, this was not the wisest thing ever being done. Then there is what you can do. But here's my difference. If you are very much cautious politician, and I believe caution was good, then be also cautious not only with your actions, but with your words. If you don't believe that Assad should go, don't say it. What is saying Erdogan? Nobody cares. Bulgarian Prime Minister can say that anybody can go. This does not have consequences. The difference with a major power is that the words, right or wrong, should be followed.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
If you say it because you think it's a matter of weeks, and you say it. What do you do later on? You stick to your words and you go to war, or you admit, okay, I was wrong?
Now listen, simply it means that you took the wrong decisions. Basically, it was not the matter of weeks. And you're paying for this. I don't believe that he should go to war. I do believe that basically, when you have a policy based on the wrong intelligence analysis, you're paying for this because you're creating expectations. And expectations in a revolutionary situation is the major driving force of a situation on the ground. On the ground, I cannot comment because, as I told you, this is not my area. What Syrians are doing, different groups and so on, you should know, like you're either basically talking to people or not. The Russian perspective is interesting from the other point of view. There is one more reason for the Russians to decide to be involved in the Middle East. And this is that Russians are convinced. It might be wrong, but the fact that I do believe it's wrong does not make them unconvinced that the drop of the oil prices was simply a political decision, very much influenced by the American average on the Middle East and especially on Saudi Arabia. So if you're a regime like the Russia's one, which is so much dependent on the oil prices, in a certain way, this is the most important thing you depend on and the only thing that you cannot influence. The problem is how you're going to influence it. And you're going to influence it when you're starting to have an influence on the ground, and especially when your relations with Saudi Arabia are changing. I do believe that many people basically are talking a lot that Russia is simply taking the Shia side. This is not exactly this. The major strategic ally for the Russians was Syria. And Egypt is not a Shia country. So from this point of view, they wanted to go on the ground. If you see basically what they're suggesting as a constitutional solution, it's Bosnia. The funny story is that if you talk to people in the Balkans, they're going to tell you that Bosnia does not work. If you go to any other place, they're going to see that we're going to do Bosnia because Bosnia works. But from this point of view, it's very important because you're going to have a highly federalized structure. And in this federalized structure, you know that it does not need to be Assad, but Alevites basically are going to have a region of their own. Kurds are going to control something. The interesting story is who is controlling the Sunni part. And here comes the interesting negotiations between the Russians and Saudis. And the effect of these very intensive negotiations between the Russians and the Saudis obviously affect the price of the oil these days. And this is, I don't believe that it was, I do believe that Saudi much more attacked gas production in the United States, which affected the price of the oil. But now the level of the intensity of the Russia-Saudi negotiations is incredible. And it also explains, I very much agree, the military base in Syria, this is a joke. To believe that they're going, but yes, loyalty matters. We are loyal. And by the way, here you have a major consistency, this is my last point, in the way Putin was doing Ukraine and he's doing Syria. Many have been asking the Russians, why did you stand with Yanukovych till the end? He was an idiot. And if you see the level of kind of disrespect which Putin and his circle has for Yanukovych, I do believe it can be compared only with the disrespect of the Ukrainian people. They really despise him. But the basic story was the message. And the message was, we are not like the Americans. We are staying with our own idiots till the end. This was not also a very wise policy, but this consistency with the great power, strangely enough, consistency is extremely important. And I very much agree with you. I don't believe that bombing Syria and going there was going to be better, but to believe that there is no price for saying he should go and not going is also, in my view, not true.
Dwa krótkie komentarze.
Very short comments. One thing is, yes, I believe that if Bosnia, some people who say that Bosnia would be good for Syria, perhaps they should talk to Bosnians. Everything looks better from a distance. But the Bosnian solution was possible because one of the parties was completely defeated. And there was a military force that could impose a solution, a wrong one, but one that could be imposed. And I can't see this happening in Syria, unless, of course, this force, this power is Russia, and it imposes its own solution. Perhaps, well, God save Syrians. But another possible option that complicates everything is that we systematically mix two orders. One of them is the order of the interests of great superpowers and various other political players, and we're talking about Americans intervening or not intervening because of the oil price, relations with Russia, relations with Iran, and we think about what would be better or worse. But parallel to that is another layer that we got used to over the last 25 years, that democratic states have the obligation to intervene on behalf of human rights and civic liberties. This is what Patrycja spoke about. Who is speaking on behalf of the Syrians? No one is, because when the guns, machine guns and bombs are speaking, the Syrians have nothing else to say. They have no voice. So when we are demanding an intervention in Syria, what we're really demanding is for us who are enjoying, let's see for how long, democracy and freedom, for us to feel responsible for those who cannot enjoy these things. So for us to abolish dictators, to help to construct democracy. And we are hugely impressed by 1989, all of us, and we think it's a role model, and that we think that the way it happened in 1989 can be reproduced in the Arabic world. So hence the comparison between the Arab Spring and the Central European autumn. And I believe that this comparison is completely impossible to draw. It's not because the Arab nations are not ready for democracy, which, by the way, is seen with a bare eye, but it is much easier to abolish dictators from than those that are stabilized internally, that are protected by many local interests. And the people whose interests are being protected are prepared to fight and die to defend those interests. And it's very difficult to change from outside.
Thank you very much. Since our guest also drew attention that we need to end punctually, I would, in conclusion, like to ask just a very brief comment, 2 sentences to sum up the discussion from all of you. I think we have a consensus, as Konstanty Gebert said, that it's an autonomous process with such a multitude of actors that any predictions, any scenarios are simply not feasible. And so maybe the question I would like to ask, what should we now expect in the coming future? Should we expect success of the Geneva talks, or should we expect crashing of the Islamic State? Or should we expect an agreement between US and Russia? What in the nearest future should be our expectation? What should we keep our fingers crossed for? Konstanty Gebert, Patrycja Sasnal, Ivan Krastev. Well, the most likely today is a victory of Assad, and the solution that Assad and his allies will dictate. The Syrians have lost, the Americans have lost, but for them it's a small expenditure. They will survive. The Russians winning, but how long can they foot the bill for that victory? And we as the European Union have this choice between decency and cowardice. And we chose cowardice. And for lack of decency, we'll still have to pay 2 things. And Russia and the Middle East and its consequences. Well, Russia, it's stated that Russia has 3 borders, the so-called imagined demographic with China, psychological with the West, and cultural to the south with Islam. And while Russia has tried to deal with the western border, the psychological border with the West, so far, for a while, they left the other 2 other borders. The demographic border with China is simply sort of parked for the future, but they're dealing now with the southern border. And I don't know, Grozny or the area should be completely culturally different than Moscow. This entire soft valley, underbelly of Russia. And I'm wondering at a number of statistics or some exertion from those statistics. That between June 2014 and November 2015, that is just 16 months, that by 300% there has been an increase of people with Russian passports fighting in the ranks of the so-called Islamic State. And this has justification, and Marat Kafkas, the leaders of the Emirates or the jihadist project, we have weakened in 2009, 2010. So they possibly are pushing the radical Muslims, Russian radical Muslims, to the caliphate. On the other hand, or second of all, one of the main tools of communication of the Islamic State, and also a tool for recruitment, is the Russian version of Facebook, Kontakten of VK. And so there are many, and this recruitment through this channel is very intensive. So we mentioned this between the lines, but this also has to be the so-called red warning light for Moscow, especially since they understood the Arab Spring as a US conspiracy against Russia, that this could also happen in Russia, that this also can happen in Poland. So for Russia, this increased presence in Syria and playing a role. For a long time, Russia had a very little presence in Syria, not only in Khartoum, but there were some military contracts. Well, there was about $8 billion. So that's not a negligible amount. The second biggest buyer of Russian arms was Syria. But anyway, this was an argument in the Russian logic to become involved in Syria. And Russia is now proving that a military solution, a military victory is possible. And possibly, as Gebert said, and this will happen in terms of agreement. Assad will get back most of the territory. And the second thing is on the Middle East and changes. Why? What I say might sound controversial. Well, for one reason, intellectual reason, it's good that Syria perseveres, that the war in Syria is continuing, because otherwise we would not realize what are the social transformations happening in the Middle East. The social transformations, they underscore political transformations, because the political transformations are the short term, in the Annal school are called short term, compared to the long term, the long duration. This is the social change which can be visible thanks to the war in Syria. The weakness of the state is continuing, not only in the Middle East, it's the ability to deliver services to the people and thinking about societies. And this is true not only in the Middle East, but also here, where the weakness of the state is increasing versus other non-state actors. The power of religion. And we don't understand this. We fail to understand this in Europe. We do not understand the heat of faith because we have been completely in a post-secular era. And we understand, like Paul Tillich used to say, that this is the ultimate concern, the most of highest importance in human life. And many people in the Middle East think about religion in that way. We no longer understand. And this is also part of the transformation, but also a struggle within Islam. Islam has this transformative version. It was described as the most Protestant of all the monotheistic religion because it has an inbuilt reform mechanism, an internal reform. Periodically, there are this ferment of fundamentalism, which topples, overturns the relations within the religion and allows it to cleanse itself. And I think this is still ongoing. But there's also the opinion, not my opinion, but Professor Rothfeld's opinion, that ISIS is the new Bolshevism, a new form of Bolshevism, a minority that imposes a system and will be gaining in popularity. So maybe this is what I will end with, namely that there's just one light in connection to the Syrian war, that intellectually it allows us to see the immense transformations happening on the gateways to Europe. I must leave, I do apologize. And
I'm also on my way to the airport. So from this point of view, just two very simple statements. As I told you, on Syria, I cannot comment, I don't know enough. But they're going to be major. This type of a conflict is going to put both Turkey and the European Union in front of the serious story to talk. We like to talk about the return of the Cold War. The return of the Cold War was the clash between two superpowers with ideology. But now European Union is facing totally different challenges on both sides. On the east, you have much more great power without ideology, while on the south, you have a new ideology without a state, because Islamic State still is not a state. How you're going to balance between these two is going to be a major issue. And I do believe that both the Western character of Turkey, especially if Turkey feels excluded from a Russia-American deal, is something not to be taken for granted. And on the other side, how the European Union is going to decide which is the major threat, Russia or the Islamic State, and basically the threat of Islamism is going to be critical. The other place to talk about that I believe here Russians has a very genuine concern is Central Asia. If you look to Central Asia demographically, institutionally, but also the spread of Islam, I mean radical Islam, it starts to remind Middle East from 10 years ago. Very young population, unemployment. Because of the oil prices, basically you have economies that cannot produce jobs. And from this point of view, I do believe this is going to be probably the next place where part of this conversation is going to talk. And the story is, can you be preventive on a global level for kind of this type of a conflict coming from a non-state actors? Who is going to be preventive? Probably this is something to be discussed. Yeah, thank you.
Bardzo serdecznie dziękuję.
very much. Thank you very much, Patrycja, you as well. Ladies and gentlemen,